What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my retrospective video for the year of 2022. I just wanted to take a bit of time in this video to decompress and go through what I've worked on for this entire year, talk about what my hobby goals were at the start, how it sort of progressed, cover what I've gotten done, what I've learned or maybe struggled with, show you some pictures and videos of some pretty models, walk through some of my favorite projects and favorite models, and then we'll do a general overview, I guess, of where I want to take 2023. So I do apologize if it's going to be a little bit scattered. I'm sort of just recording as I go. I'm going through, I'm reorganizing my display cabinets, and I'm also implementing some new lighting. So my room is a bit of a mess. So I'm just sort of setting up my camera and taking pictures and videos wherever I can set the models up. And I also had a pretty high model count for this past year. 363, I think, all in. It does get padded a little bit with some of the Marvel terrain, which I'll cover as I go through each of the segments. But even if you take that out, it's still pretty high, much higher, I think, in fact, than some of my previous years. So I'll throw it up on the screen. I actually have an Excel document where I've been tracking for the past couple of years the total models and what I've painted in each of the years. I think I started in 2019 or 2020, right around the pandemic. So guys, future me here. Unfortunately, the microphone cut out when I was recording this video, as well as I think 2 other videos ahead. And unfortunately, I didn't realize this until I had cleaned everything up and then pulled the video off of my computer. So rather than set everything back up, pull out 300 plus models and re-record everything, I'm just gonna record this talking head from the future. We had originally planned to go to Adepticon in March earlier this year, but I think as the weeks and months progressed, right around like end of January, early mid-February, with the state of the no mask, no vaccine mandates in Illinois, the incredibly high cases, and the fact that a lot of our social circle still has either immunocompromised family members we interact with daily, or kids who were at that point still unvaccinated, we chose not to go. So that did end up furloughing a lot of plans, but on the flip side, it gave me the opportunity to shutter a bunch of hobby goals that I had originally planned and then refocus what I wanted to do with the rest of the year. So right around March or April, once I completed a large bulk of Marvel commissions, I sat myself down and I made the decision to basically tackle all of my backlog. I wanted to have, by the end of this year, no unpainted models. Spoiler alert, I did fail, but it gave me a goal and a way to build a schedule or a routine over the next 8 months to actually work through a lot of this backlog. So in the next clip ahead, I'll actually walk through what I painted, but the goal was to effectively finish off some of my older armies. I had some odds and ends models from Combat Patrols and box sets where they weren't in my list, but the models I still owned, just because they came with the set. I also updated a couple of existing armies for the new edition of Age of Sigmar. I did start a brand new army, my Blood Angels, which I'll talk about later on, and then also working through a lot of my Marvel backlog. A lot of it is because they are dual kits. I wanted one model for an affiliation, but then the other part of that model doesn't get used. And I had quite a few of them from Marvel models I'd already owned, but didn't want to play. So there were probably about a dozen of those sitting in my backlog. I did work through about half of them this year, although half of them are still unpainted. So I'll talk about those ahead. So I'm going to walk through from left to right in no particular order. This is just how I've organized them from the display cabinet, just to have them on the table, just to show off. I don't actually remember in what order I painted them, with the exception of, for example, my Blood Angels for Horus Heresy, which was a chunk near the end of summer and the start of fall, just continuous. And then a lot of my Marvel models were either at the very start of the year or at the very, very end. But beyond that, it was sort of just working in batches as the inspiration struck. And the goal for me was to basically finish projects. I'm very much the kind of person who wants to finish off a single project and move on, rather than do a bit here for one, do a bit here for another, and at the end arrive at the goal. So when I was tackling these projects, if I was, for example, working on the Nighthaunt, I was going to do all of the units all at once, finish them all, check off the project, and then move on to the next, for example, the Bonereapers or the Necrons. Again, don't know what order I painted them in, just that they got done. So to round out my existing collections, I have some AOS stuff. So I've got my Nighthaunt units, my Ossiarch in the back here. I've got some Necrons, a couple of display pieces, not as many as I would have liked, but I'll circle back to those at the end. House Tyrannus, Mechanicus, ongoing commission. I did my entire Blood Angels Legion. Now, this isn't the entire collection. I think, as I mentioned, I still do have a few models to paint. A Moritat, 3 Javelins, a Kratos, and a Spartan, but this is what I was gaming with, and I was painting as I was expanding my 3,000 point list. So, got that. And then at the end there, I have my Marvel personal collection. So this is what I painted for myself, with the exception of Malekith and Lizard here in the back, which are commissions that haven't been shipped off yet. And then my Marvel Crisis Protocol Urban Board, all the terrain I've got painted in the back there. So my Bonereapers have always been, I guess, a love-hate thing. I actually painted them at the start of the lockdown. I hadn't been unemployed yet, so I was still working from home, but the writing was sort of on the wall. I got a sense that if I wasn't going to be laid off immediately, it was going to end up happening anyways. And I needed a way to fill the time. I wasn't really working on projects for work because our clients had phased down their projects. And in order to keep my sanity, to keep myself busy, I ended up painting my Bonereaper army. And when they released the White Dwarf earlier this year, that sort of expanded the army, I felt like it would be a cool way to dip my toe back into Age of Sigmar, try the new edition. This was before the new Nighthaunt Battletome came out, and I wanted to add a couple more Mortek guards, so a big block of 20. I wanted to try the recursion with the Harvester. I finally got my Nexus painted, my Bone-Tithe Nexus, which I actually ended up converting with some 3D printed parts to sort of fit the Japanese theme or motif for the army. It actually took me quite a while to find the parts and pieces that I felt would suit the army. And then, so this centerpiece is actually an amalgam of a couple of different files that were cut apart and resized. And I ended up having to print them in segments, cut them from the actual original STL, combine them, and then print them in pieces to get the stepped temple pattern. I debated playing around with scratch building a lot of it and scaling up the size of the temple so it felt like you actually walk in there. Ultimately, line of sight and, more importantly, models being able to move around the sides of the Nexus was actually really important. I realized when I was playing games that it was important that models were able to move around, and I couldn't or didn't want to play around with the silhouette or the footprint of the original Nexus. So what I ended up doing was I scaled the center portion, that little middle part, so it's almost the same height as the original statue. The only difference is those little pillars on the side are much shorter, but not as big a deal. So there's these little temple light shrines on the corners, and then I just kept everything else the same. It was actually a lot of fun to paint. These skeletons were a little annoying to highlight, but otherwise I enjoyed it. And then I picked up the Shadespire crew, literally just for that one model. I wanted a Mortisan to unlock all of my Stalkers and the Necropolis, the Immortus Guard. So Necropolis Stalkers and the Immortus Guard as battle line. And I don't like any of the core Mortisan models. I think they look kind of flimsy. But as a Reaper, phenomenal. So I picked up the kit, painted up that model, mounted them on a 40 mil base, and that rounded up the Bonereaper collection. Of course, once I finished this, a couple months later, the Nighthaunt Battletome came out, and that's when I ended up pivoting to the Nighthaunt and expanding my army for that. So my Nighthaunt, I've always loved painting the army. I think the aesthetic of it is really cool, and it was fun to pivot back to them when they had a couple of new releases before their new Battletome. So the two new characters, Allrock, the Drowner, and the Scriptor Mortis. I actually really enjoyed these two. Some of my more favorite models to paint in the year, even though they aren't necessarily display pieces, they were just a lot of fun. I got 10 of the Craven Throne. I was really excited to paint them. Wasn't a huge fan of the models until I saw them in person. Just, I felt the crossbows were a little dinky. But I really loved the idea of Nighthaunt getting a little more ranged shooting. Of course, once I picked up the unit, they released the rules for them, and they were ass. So it was a struggle to paint them in the sense that I knew I was never going to field them, but I have them in my collection, so that's cool. And then I've got 10 Hex Wraiths in the back. Something I've always wanted to add, wasn't, again, a huge fan of the models. I struggled for quite a few months to try and find suitable conversions, but ultimately went with the stock Games Workshop kits. So I combined the Hex Wraith model with some pieces from the Black Knight, mainly the armor on the Barding. And the goal was just to bulk up the model, make it feel a little bit more substantial, and I think I like them a lot more. And they're really, really good in the new book. The fact that they can double move. They lost their move over in Mortal Wounds, but I feel like as blockers, they're cheap, they're fast, and they're really efficient for their points. Also battle line. Thoroughly enjoy using them. I wish I had one more unit of 5, but honestly, I think with Scarlet Doom, I'm not really struggling to find ways to fill out my points. My Necrons was more or less finishing models in my collection. All the stuff that you see here painted, I'm probably never going to actually use, but they're just holdovers from existing larger box sets. So Indominus was a really good example. I picked up, or I had the Overlord from that. I think I had the Reanimator and a bunch of the Warriors. The Pariah box set gave me the Cryptek, some flayed ones. Just models I have lying around. I didn't feel like getting rid of them just because I wouldn't really get the value, but it was cool just to round out the collection, add a few more models. And again, I think I painted them after coming off of a commission binge. So I worked on a huge string of models. I think it was the X-Men and Brotherhood commission project. And I was getting sick of painting Marvel models for a bit, just to that like sort of high level. I wanted just to crank out some army models, finish some projects, paint some regular metallics. And I think that's actually where I fit in the Necrons and the Nighthaunt. It was just filler pieces or filler projects as a palette cleanser in between doing a lot of non-metal metal. So it's actually a lot of fun painting them. Necrons are always easy to paint, super fast, and just more models to add to the collection. My Blood Angels were probably the largest distraction of the year. I really only got into it because of... Okay, so I got into the game because I'm a huge fan of the narrative setting, and I played a lot of Horus Heresy when it first came out. So I was in Vegas at the time. I did my Ultramarines, and I played it as a mobile, rhino-mounted, sort of mid-range skirmishing gunline. So I had a lot of tactical squads, a lot of veteran squads. I had heavy support squads in rhinos. I had a lot of whirlwinds. And the idea was to lay supporting fire and support, because we played a lot of team games. So I didn't have to necessarily build a strong standalone army, although I felt like Pride of the Legion with a Primarch Death Star was sort of the only real way you could play back in the original edition of Heresy. But it was more in a larger supportive team game. We played a lot of pairs and then massive mega battles. So my goal was to basically use Goldman, make rhino scoring, sit on objectives, and just lay down fire while everyone else engaged in combat and fought to the death. I wanted to pivot away and did something different for this version of Horus Heresy. So I did a lot of jump infantry, a lot of dreadnoughts, a lot of fighting units, and almost no rhinos, no tactical squads, no vet squads. I'm not running Pride. I typically run an unmarked Rite of War, so no rights, and just a couple of characters and supporting units. I think the reason that I failed in getting all of my unpainted models finished for the year was because of Horus Heresy. I love the game. I think in retrospect, I probably could have not gone as hard into it as I did, or maybe started off going combined arms and not leaning so much into just pure Assault Marines. I ended up spending, I think, 2.5 months painting this Legion, and I think that was, like, it was time well spent. I enjoyed doing it. I'm glad I have the army done, but at the same time, it did cost me the ability to finish everything else the rest of the year. And there's a lot of units in here that I ended up painting and not using. So like one of the Leviathans, the Deredeos, at least one of the Dawnbreaker squads, a few of the heroes, things like that. Not really much to say. This is probably... So the projects you see here from left to right, apart from those 3 models in the back, are all quick and dirty tabletop quality models. Nothing really fancy to look at, so I don't really want to spend too much time focusing on them. More just remarking on the fact that I got a lot of army painting done this year, largely just finishing up existing projects. The actual fun projects I think I worked on this year were Marvel related. A lot of stuff that I worked on near the start of the year were Marvel models. I took a break to work on jank army stuff in between. And then I ended the year doing a lot of more high quality Marvel stuff. And my collection has grown a sizable amount this year. I didn't think it would explode the way it did, but the amount of models I painted for my own collection, the stuff I've painted for commission work. So what you see here in front of you is just, I would say maybe half of what I painted for Marvel, maybe even only a third. A large portion of my more higher quality, still tabletop models, but bordering on display, were commission projects that I ended up selling off or shipping off to my client. Do I regret spending all that time doing commissions? No, largely because I'm being paid for them. I'm being paid fairly. And it allows me to paint models that I wouldn't normally paint for my own collection. So as an example, X-Men or X-Force, I'm not really inspired by those affiliations. So I don't think I would collect them for myself. But then it gives me a chance to paint those models. They're cool. And then, for example, the Brotherhood, painting them has inspired me to want to collect that affiliation. So I know that that's on the docket for the next year. I also spent a lot of time working on terrain. And I know I did my subway board last year, but that was just a lot of sort of papercraft, texture painting or printing, and then some MDF quote unquote woodworking. Not an actual lot of terrain painting. And this urban board, I think, was actually the first fully painted table project I've actually done in my entire career. I've always tried dipping my toe into doing AOS, fantasy, and 40K tables. I've built and collected a lot of pieces for it, but I've never actually fully painted for it. I think a part of it is the scale of the tables, the amount of terrain you would have to have, and then the detailing of it. For example, 40K, a lot of skulls, a lot of industrial detailing, and just painting it is a lot of monotony and not something I would enjoy doing, which I think has always killed that motivation. Whereas for the Marvel board, I've picked up a lot of techniques and ability to paint quickly, especially using oils and weathering to get good looking terrain done pretty quickly. And I was able to get a pretty decent amount of terrain done for a 3x3. Although I do want to expand more, have a lot more ideas to create more variety in the terrain. I've played probably about a dozen games now with this terrain set, and it's starting to feel a little stale. But one of the good things about Marvel, both in terms of the affiliations you collect as well as the tables you play, you only really need to paint or add a couple of pieces here and there, and you can really drastically change the way that your game feels or plays, either from a strategic perspective with the models you play with or with terrain. Just adding one or two size 3s or 4s can really change the dynamic of the setup of a table. A few more buildings here and there, more trucks to throw, even adding in a restaurant with a patio really changes the setting of the table. So for me, I've really enjoyed doing that. And I want to do a lot more of that in the new year. Less high intensity models like the actual figures themselves, and more just quick and easy tabletop pieces, a lot more scratch building, and a lot more terrain work. I really enjoy doing that, where the focus is less on painting little details, but telling a story with the board. So looking forward to working on that. In terms of the actual affiliations I painted, so I completed the Black Order, start to finish. I painted up a couple of models to finish off my Convocation. So I've got OG Strange and Magic. My Web Warriors, I had Moon Knight, and then the Rivals Spider-Man. For my Spider Foes, I had Green Goblin, Kraven, and the Rivals Dr. Octopus. For S.H.I.E.L.D. and Assorted, I have Hulkbuster, Core Iron Man, and then the Iron Man that pairs with Hulkbuster. For my A-Force, I have Angela, Crystal, Domino, Enchantress, Scarlet Witch, and Captain Marvel. And then a couple of these models, in particular, Domino and Scarlet Witch, I want to slot into a lot of my other rosters or a lot of affiliations. Domino in particular, really great support piece, 3 threat, hands up incinerate, and then Scarlet Witch is just an amazing Mystic Bruiser that I can slot into my Black Order, my Web Warriors, even my A-Force to diversify the damage profile. And she's just such a great model. I had a Colossus just for funsies, the Sentinel affiliation, which I actually ended off the year with. And then as the commissions, I have Malekith and Lizard, which I haven't shipped off yet. So in this list of models I've painted for the year, you can actually see a fairly sizable column on the left-hand side as well. I believe it's 43 miniatures. These are actually all of the Marvel models I painted as a commission for my client. So working the way top to bottom, you can see it's pretty much all of the X-Men roster, as well as all of the Brotherhood roster. And then below that, I've got a smattering of a bunch of other models, some Spider Foes, some Syndicate, as well as some random Shield and Asgard and Assorted models. A lot of the tail end figures I painted for my clients ended up being in small batches of 1s, 2s, or 3s. So unfortunately, I didn't actually manage to get a full group shot of all of those models. They were all painted up as 1 or 2 offs and then shipped to the client. I kind of wish I had been able to take a photo of all of those models together, but unfortunately, because my client wanted them for events that were happening throughout the year, we ended up just painting them and sending them off as they were completed. For quote-unquote display models, one of the one-offs I painted this year was this Emperor's Champion. This is a classic model from way back in 3rd edition. I believe he was released around the time of the Armageddon campaign. I'd originally had one back in 3rd edition for my Black Templars army. I sold it when I'd sold the army off, and then about 10 years ago, I actually found one on eBay that was unpainted and had sort of just sat on him waiting for my painting abilities to develop and mature to a point where I'd want to tackle this sort of nostalgic model again. And then larger display figurines, I have the Celtic figure, which was for our local display show, as well as a Greek hoplite from scale 75, and a Roman Centurion from Nocturnal Miniatures. The Celtic Warrior was more for show piece because the model is for sale. So we wanted to make sure that we had a fully painted version at least a month or two in advance of the show so we could sell some of those models. I picked up the Centurion because I've been really looking forward to painting the model. It was a cool pose. I'm a huge fan of the Roman Legionnaire, the color schemes, the lore of it. The actual figure itself was very disappointing. A lot of miscasting, a lot of sculpting issues. I think about the only parts of the model I enjoyed were the shield and the cape. Everything else I could have just not painted. The Greek hoplite was actually a lot of fun. I picked this one up at Adepticon quite a few years ago, but never actually got around to painting him. I think if I were to do it again, I'd probably do it in non-metal. But I wanted to try something a little bit different and to actually show that you could do a good looking display model with regular metallic paints without using any non-metal tricks. I really enjoyed painting the shield of this figure, as well as the free hand on the leather straps. It was pretty tough for me to actually try and narrow down my favorite projects and then my favorite models of the year. I am pretty confident in saying that I enjoyed working on pretty much everything that I painted throughout this year. Although, of course, there were ups and downs and highs and lows for each project. And I think it was largely because I was able to swap between the more higher level Marvel miniatures with some of the more lowbrow things like Necrons, my Nighthaunt, and my Bonereapers. I was able to sort of maintain and ride that up and down wave of when do I want to paint some high quality models versus when do I just want to crank out and grind and finish out some projects. So I think I've narrowed down my favorite 3 projects in terms of collections I painted, and with no surprise, it's all Marvel related. So the first is my Black Order affiliation, and then there is my Sentinel affiliation, and then there is the actual gaming table itself. So the table itself, as I've already mentioned, is my first fully completed and fully painted gaming table. I really enjoyed working this because it was basically just really quick, really simple techniques, bold colors, and it was all built around balancing organic materials, a lot of plants, a lot of foliage, finding the right trees with the more urban elements like the apartment buildings, the subway stations, and then a lot of the urban scatter like the construction stuff, the garbage, the dumpsters, etc. I ended up doing a lot of tiny things because they were so quick and easy to do. 2-tone airbrush, some oil washes, pen washes, weathering, and then some decals. And that was it. Super simple, and I was able to finish off this 3x3. Obviously, I don't have all of the terrain here. I still have a fair amount of terrain just off to the side that I didn't want to overclutter this display with. But all of that was done in about a month's time, and no one piece took more than a day or two, with the exception of the apartment buildings. They were about a week for the 2 of them, maybe a week and a half. Everything else, super simple. And Honestly, I'm looking forward to working on this table more, expanding the terrain set more in the new year. I've got a lot of great ideas for things I want to try, a lot of scratch building. I'm probably going to veer away from pre-made terrain sets and lean a lot more on textured plastic art or textured sheeting, and hoping to use that with some painting. And then the similar techniques to get them done more quickly, but in a more bespoke and custom manner. My second favorite project this year was the Black Order affiliation. In particular, Thanos, but there are quite a few of the Black Order I actually really enjoyed painting. The Black Order affiliation, in particular Thanos, was just a lot of fun to paint. I really enjoyed working on Thanos in particular with his skin, the non-metal metal, and just finding that right balance of colors and values, along with the brighter base that I have used for my collection. I think this Thanos would have looked better on a darker base, maybe like a gray urban base or something like a cold steel or something like a dark black metal. But I wanted him to fit into my current collection, so it was a little bit of a tricky challenge to figure out, okay, well, where can I push the shadows and have highlights beside it to try and get him to stand out on what is still a mid-bright tone base. I also really enjoyed working on Supergiant and Black Swan, two of my favorite models and the newest additions to the Black Order affiliation. I'm really happy with how her skin turned out. And then for Supergiant, the white ceramic armor, along with the energy and then the white cape, just great fun. I enjoyed working on all of these models a lot. It was also cool because a lot of the Marvel models I've painted to date don't have a uniform. And it was cool to actually paint a collection of models with a cohesive color scheme. And then finally, there is the Sentinel affiliation. These were the last three models I actually painted in the year, so they're the freshest in my mind. Unlike the Hulkbuster, where I went all in and spent, I think it was like 50, 55 hours on a single model, I ended up dumbing down the quality just a touch on the three Sentinels. If you actually look at them from the tabletop, there's not much difference in quality, at least you don't think there is, between these three models and the Hulkbuster. In that end, it was just balancing out, okay, I know I'm painting three of these back to back to back. I'm not cutting corners, but how can I maintain my sanity in order to achieve a pretty good quality without driving myself crazy or, again, hitting that sort of peak and then drop that tends to happen when a project takes too long or when I start to lose interest and the paint quality suffers. I also ended up spending almost 4 weeks working on these three models, where the Hulkbuster took one. And by breaking it down into small sections and really only painting each day when I actually had the motivation to work on them, I was able to maintain that consistent level. I would say like 80 or 90%, in combination with that sort of rougher, battle-worn textural look of the finish of the armor, helped to keep the creative juices flowing, and I was able to just maintain that momentum working on these three models. I'm super stoked to see where they take this affiliation. I'm not a huge X-Men fan. I don't know much about the X-Men or the mutants or the Sentinels and sort of, I guess, that cartoon era. I never grew up watching those. I watched Spider-Man, so I don't know what would belong or associate with the Sentinel affiliation. I know that they're mutant hunters, and I know some of the non-mutant like military personnel like Trask or whatever. Maybe I might expand into like Syndicate, Cabal, or Hydra. Maybe they'll fit well with the Sentinels. Either way, I'm looking forward to playing with these three models. And it should come with no surprise, I think. Without a doubt, my favorite model of the year is the Hulkbuster. We can include the mini Iron Man that comes along with it as well. But in terms of models that I was looking forward to painting the most, the model that I ended up pushing myself the most to paint on, the one that I am the most happy with in terms of the end result, there is no doubt in my mind that it is the Hulkbuster for this year. There were a couple of runner-ups that I feel, both in terms of just the sculpt of the model that I was looking forward to, enjoying the process, and then being pretty happy with the end result. There were a couple of runner-ups. I found it difficult to narrow down even the top five. It was tough because there were so many models I enjoyed. And because I already had the top three favorite projects of the year, I wanted to make my, instead of top five, which would have been not so much quality, but models I also enjoyed, so why weren't they included in projects? I decided just to have, hands down, favorite model of the year, and it would be the Hulkbuster. So all in, this model was probably about 50 hours, not including the prep time, and that's just 50 hours for him. I think the mini Iron Man added another 12, 15 hours. I didn't really count on him. It was more the big one that I was concerned about. Just in terms of pushing myself to tackle the sheer amount of non-metal working through the placement on each individual piece, making sure that it was super polished, and making sure I recorded it not every step, but a large part of the steps in terms of not just the recipe and technique, but going through and breaking it down. It was a huge exercise for me in terms of pushing my technical ability as a painter in the vein of my current, more painterly style. I could definitely spend a lot more time going in, perfecting the blends, making sure that it is the most perfect possible piece. But because this isn't going for a competition and it was more still just a tabletop piece, I felt that at the 50-hour mark, I was happy enough with it that I don't think that further nuancing or further tweaking would have any significant gains on a tabletop viewing. So what I mean by that is, I think the model where it is, I would say it's probably 80 or 85%, but that last 15, 20% of effort I could put into polish it is not going to be super noticeable unless you zoom right in and you're looking at the model from like an inch and a half away. Typical tabletop viewing is, I would say 3 to 4 feet, maybe even 5, depending on where you're standing, the position of the model, and maybe your opponent's view. And for that last 15 or 20% doesn't really net you a whole lot. And so because I won't be submitting this for a painting contest or anything like that, I think I'm perfectly happy with the way it is. The only thing that I would have issue with probably is the smoke, largely in part due to the simplicity of the blend and then my just not putting in as much effort. I think I could have probably gone back in and freehanded a lot more of those swirls or little details if I wanted to try my hand at sculpting, or maybe even 3D printing an alternative smoke effect. It might have been a little bit better. I might be a little bit more happy with it, but I think overall it still frames the piece pretty well, and even if it's not the most optimal piece, I still try and fit in the Hulkbuster in as many lists as I can. Within the narrative, of course, he fits in as a good guy, so he doesn't really slot into any of my bad guy affiliations. I think in terms of runners-up, some close seconds, thirds, fourths. Thanos, definite contender, but because I'd already put him in my favorite top 3 projects, doesn't really make sense to put him in also as a singles. Also, I think in terms of the finish, very similar, but I think the Hulkbuster is better, so obviously not a top choice. And then my final Marvel model pick would have been Captain Marvel. One of the first Marvel models I painted this year, and actually one of my still all-time favorite sculpts from Atomic Mass. I know it's probably one of the older sculpts in the range, I think, because she is in the core box, so one of the first few to be released. But there is something super fantastic about her understated pose. Every bit of sculpting detail on her is super crisp. The way that the non-metal trimming on her star and the banding that runs around her shoulders is just immaculate, perfect, crisp in terms of the sculpting where you're able to get in there and paint every single edge. That you can't really do on some of the other Marvel models because they end up being a little fuzzy in the details or the edges aren't quite as sharp. Maybe a mold line happened to be there. I've yet to find another Marvel model that paints up as well as Captain Marvel does. I think Okoye is a close second. There's also the movement on her sash, and then in terms of the painting, doing the source lighting on her eyes is just, I enjoyed everything about this model, the simplicity of it. Now that I have more of an A-Force affiliation put together, I may try and get some games in with her as well, especially with the card buff that she got recently. And then some of my other top models would have been the Scriptor Mortis, as well as All Rock the Drowner, both from Nighthaunt. So in terms of the actual painting on these models itself, nothing fancy. They're probably actually quite a few tiers, if we're doing tiers, lower than the rest of my Marvel models. Very simple. I think it's a 2-tone primary palette with a tertiary contrast color, and then very simple, like 2-tone metallics with a wash. So it's very bare bones tabletop, but I'm a huge fan of the Nighthaunt aesthetic. And when these 2 models were released,
I absolutely had to get my hands on them to paint them, even if I was never going to play with them, get them on the tabletop. Just there's so much storytelling, so much narrative in these models. The scripted mortis especially is just the perfect balance of just a variety of details and textures, enough to incorporate a variety of different colors without necessarily having any piece go overboard or overpower anything. And in a moment of inspiration, I chose to paint the candles in the flesh tone brown color of the robes. I don't know why. I've never done the candles that way before. The model that springs to mind is Reichnor. Quite an old model. I painted him in the first wave of Nighthaunt, and I painted the candles in sort of a bone, sort of khaki ivory color. Doesn't really pop, doesn't stand out. It looks pretty mediocre. And for the scripter and a flash of inspiration, I just chose, why not just use the brown tone, because there's no brown tone anywhere else in the model. And it looks phenomenal. I think if I were to ever actually bring Reichnor to a tournament again, I'd probably either repaint my current model or more than likely paint another one and do a new base, because I'm honestly not a huge fan of the base either.
In terms of my hobby goals for 2023, so from January to March, I'm going to be doing a lot of Adepticon focus or Adepticon prep. The event that my friends and I are planning on going on for sure is the Age of Sigmar team tournament, which I believe is the Saturday and Sunday. We're still waiting on the new handbook to release the scenarios, objectives, and then confirming the new points to finalize our list. But I think thematically right now we're focusing on double Daughters of Cain and double Lumineth Realm Lords. More than likely I'll be doing the Morathi list. So it's going to be Morathi, big and small, and then 20 either Witches or Sisters of Slaughter. So I'm really looking forward to that. It'll be a nice change of pace of painting a different Age of Sigmar army that isn't death. I'm also going to be painting a couple of entries for the Path of the Worthy painting contest hosted by Atomic Mass Games. There are 3 entry categories: singles, duels, and a team. So it's 1 model, 2 models fighting, and then 3 to 6 models. When I had first heard of the contest, I had quite a few ideas actually on what I wanted to do, but there are strict rules in the sense that, in particular also, the no models that don't fit in the narrative of My World Crisis Protocol are allowed. So what that means is if the model has not been officially released as a design by Atomic Mass, it's not allowed. That includes all variants, future and past, that may exist in the comic narrative, but not in the game. So for example, Thor. I had originally wanted to do the Revengers as the team entry. So it would be Thor, Valkyrie, Gladiator Hulk, and maybe Loki on Sakaar from Thor Ragnarok. Would have heavily converted the models, however, because none of them exist as sculpts from Atomic Mass Games, that entry would not have been allowed. So effectively, there's quite a few entries that I had ideas for that are no longer allowed. So I need to figure out, 1, what I'm going to have time for, and 2, what I'll actually be able to finish and enter into the contest. What may end up happening is I'll enter in Hulkbuster for singles. I'll enter in, depending on what affiliation I can play, if any, in an event. Talk about that in a second. I'll probably enter my Black Order as the team, and then I'll focus on making 1 really good entry for the duel. There's no prize money. I don't care about the trophies, so I'd rather just have 1 really good entry, submit that, and then call that a day. I'm also hoping that there is a Marvel event either on the Thursday or the Friday. I'm not going to be playing all 4 days. My ideal Adepticon schedule is 3 days of gaming, 1 day off. Ideally Thursday gaming, Friday off in preparation for 2 full days, 8 to 8, 8 to 5, or 7:30 to 5 on the Saturday and Sunday the team tournament. So I'm still waiting for them to finalize the event schedule before I can confirm what I'm working on. If I do end up playing in a Marvel event, I'll probably build a display board depending on which affiliation I plan on. In the summer, the confirmed things I want to work on as well, I want to continue expanding my Marvel Crisis Protocol board. I have a lot of ideas for additional, especially larger pieces of terrain. We're talking size 3, 4, and 5. I'm not just constantly using the same 2 apartment buildings. For sure, I want to do a bus stop with a big size 4 or size 5 bus. I want to do a restaurant with a patio with those cool little umbrellas or parasols, or maybe a bar outside. I want to do a big parquet. I think that'll be really cool with benches and trees and stuff like that. And then maybe something a little bit more urban, maybe a construction site. I don't know, but that's one thing I want to focus on for a month or two in the summer. Another thing that Atomic Mass is releasing in the summer is the brand new Shatterstrike game. I'm a huge fan of the Star Wars universe, although caveat not the new films. And I'm really looking forward to painting some larger scale Star Wars figures. So I'm definitely dedicating a couple of months in my summer to work on that, both as a personal project, and then chances are I may get some for that. I don't know, hint, hint. And then throughout the first 2 months of the year and then the months leading up to the summer, I'll be working on both commissions. I still have a few projects to work on. I'm also going to be working on the aforementioned backlogs. I've still got about a half a dozen Marvel models and then a few bigger display models. I've got a couple of random kits that I picked up that I just want to work on for fun. And then I have a Gaz Gold I'm painting for this charity 40K in 40 minutes thing to work on as well. So those are my firm plans for 2023. And I'm deliberately keeping it open. I don't want to overwhelm myself with too many projects throughout the year because chances are things will happen along the way and they'll distract me. I think my friends are also talking about doing another burst of Horus Heresy in the summer. The assumption is they'll release new plastic kits, and then I still have a few things like my Moritat, some Javelins, a Kratos, and my Spartan to work on. So that'll also take up at least a month or two of my time.
And that brings me to the last part of this retrospective where I reflect a bit on my content creation journey and how it's been for, I guess, the past year and where I see it going moving forward. I'm hitting a point now where I'm finding the right groove and the right rhythm, and I'm getting that momentum for the kind of videos and the kind of content that I want to be producing. This past year, I was bouncing around between, am I doing entertainment videos? Am I doing tutorial videos? Or am I blending between the two of them? And I think, honestly, reflecting back on the kinds of videos I've been able to record and the way that I've had to go about doing it, one, I found the technique and the manner in which I want to record the videos in a way that allows me the freedom to experiment and to play around with the miniatures I'm painting and not just have to paint under the pressure of it has to be perfect the first time. And the second is that I don't have the personality to be a video entertainer, not that kind of, I guess, a personality in terms of content creator. So a lot of my videos moving forward in the new year will be focused. I'll still be doing the vlogs every month. At the very start, it'll be focused on sort of my road to Adepticon and then an Adepticon recap afterwards. And I think they're a nice way to just sort of recap the month and plan out ahead the next few weeks. But I'm also going to be doing just a lot more tutorial style videos, teaching you how I paint various projects along the way and less so on entertainment. As always, I'll continue to produce videos for my Patreon as well, focusing on a balance of some of my more gaming focused pieces, as well as trying to just get in the rhythm of producing more display oriented pieces. So hopefully I'll be able to stay consistent on that. Something I also struggled with in 2022 was constantly falling behind or being sidetracked by projects, being distracted by other things that meant that I wasn't producing videos weeks or even potentially months in advance. And I don't want to be in that state. I want to make sure that I'm giving myself the flexibility or the leeway to record content well in advance. And so I'm not rushed week after week after week. I had debated earlier in this year whether I wanted to continue doing weekly videos on YouTube or switch to something bi-weekly or even once per month. I think for the most part, I'm going to keep doing weekly. What I will probably do is make sure that I intersperse simpler models throughout the course of each month so that each week's video isn't super high octane, high intensity. I want to keep producing those like 10, 15 minute videos. Very easy to clip down and then narrate on top of. And I think that pretty much wraps up this retrospective video. It's been a long day. Today is December the 26th. I started my recording today at around 10 a.m. and that's when I started taking apart my display cabinet, setting up for the retrospective, doing all of the LED lighting, which also meant taking everything out of the cabinets, wiping everything down, including all the glass, reorganizing all the models in both, finding the space If you've paid attention in the background, you'll notice that I've rearranged some of the contents. In particular, the top shelf is empty. Marvel's still the same. I used to have a lot of single models in this shelf. They were all of models I've painted over my past 20 years. I still own various competitions or just single pieces or whatever have you. I've replaced that with my Blood Angels, which won't be played until probably summer of next year. The models that were in here are now at the bottom. I used to use the bottom two shelves for storage, and I used to use the top as well as a storage and a queue for models that were up and coming. So I've moved those single old display models down here because I don't really look at them very often, but I don't want to box them up and put them in storage. And I've got my finished commission projects at the bottom here. So stuff that I've finished for commissions, they're photographed, they're approved by the client, but they haven't been sent out. I don't want to have them in my Tupperware containers where my in-queue projects now are. So that'll keep them safe in the bottom there, protected, out of the way. And then I'm leaving the top shelf open because I will be doing Daughters of Cain for Adepticon. I'm starting off with the 1,000 points for singles. So it's going to be Morathi and 20 witches. And then depending on what the new handbook and the new points will determine the list. It might be another hero. It might be like 5 Canary or an endless spell. But I think at some point, I do want to continue expanding the army. If not Daughters of Cain, maybe I'll look into another elf army. It's not going to be Lumineth. It could be Idoneth Deepkin. I don't know. I'm not sure. I have a few armies that are also at the local hobby store. So what I may end up doing is maybe bringing one of them back, like the Bonereapers. Although not likely because it's easier to keep the army there for like pick up Age of Sigmar games. But I definitely want to have more room in the future for the coming year because I just know I'm going to probably start another army or just need the spillover room for models. This shelf here is still empty. Typically what I do is, because this is the display board that I have for my Nighthaunt, I usually keep my current 2,000 point list right there. So whenever I want to play with them, I know it's this shelf, it's that current list. I pull them all out, put them in the case, and then if I'm going to an event, I can just take that shelf as my display board. Because I'm going to be grinding a lot of Age of Sigmar games in prep for Adepticon, getting familiar with the new handbook, and then I still love Nighthaunt as an army, so they're probably going to be my primary army for the current edition of Age of Sigmar. So I currently have them, the 2,000 point army, in my half case. There's no sense in me taking them out of the case, putting them back, because it's something like 60, 65 models. I don't want to do it every week if I know that every Wednesday I'm going to go to the hobby shop and get a game in of Age of Sigmar. So they're going to stay in the case for now, and then once I start getting enough practice with that and I start playing more with the Daughters of Cain, Nighthaunt will go back there, Daughters, half case. But it looks pretty. So I got lost in a tangent there. It is now 7:45 in the evening, so it's been a solid 8.5, 9-hour day of just recording, cleaning, getting those LED strips tested and all set up, reorganizing, more recording, and then putting everything back in. So I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm cranky, I'm thirsty, and I'm pretty much going to call it there. I hope everyone had a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I look forward to continue putting out awesome content for you in the new year. I will see you in 2023. Happy New Year, best wishes, and until next time, happy hobbying.